In the spring of 1946, in the small coastal town of Withernsea, a 3-year-old boy named Peter Greenwood left a cinema with his brother and sister and began the short walk home along the promenade. No sound, no witnesses, no trace. A child vanished in full daylight on a street where every face was familiar. How could someone disappear completely in a place too small for secrets? The Greenwoods were a working family like most others. Marion, the mother, had soft eyes and a face that had aged quickly in the war years. She kept the house on Prince's Avenue tidy and warm despite the shortages. Her 3 children, Shirley, aged 8, Bill, 6, and little Peter, only 3, were her pride and the rhythm of her days. Their father worked long hours and was often away. It was Marion who walked them to the market, who made sure their shoes were mended, who believed the sea air kept them strong. The war had taken enough. Now she wanted normal things again: laughter, routine, and safety. Peter was the smallest, the quietest, the one who always tried to keep up. He had dark curls, a white jumper that seemed too big for him, and a steady, curious gaze. He followed his brother and sister everywhere, copying their games, repeating their words, learning the world by imitation. The neighbors called him the Shadow, because where Bill went, Peter went too. He was a child people smiled at in passing, bright-eyed, polite, never troublesome. Nothing about him suggested tragedy. On the afternoon of April 30th, 1946, the weather was mild enough for the children to walk to the cozy cinema on Queen Street, a small picture house showing a matinee for youngsters. Marion let them go alone, as mothers did then. The town was small, the streets familiar, and danger seemed like something that happened elsewhere. The cinema was barely half a mile from home. Bill and Shirley promised to bring Peter straight back once the show ended. The film finished around 4 o'clock. The children stepped out into the early evening light and began the walk home, tracing the promenade that curved along the sea. They played Follow the Leader, a game they always loved. Bill led, striding ahead with the confidence of 6 years old. Shirley followed, arms out for balance, pretending to be an explorer. Peter trailed behind, taking shorter, eager steps, his small boots clapping softly against the concrete. The wind blew from the east, carrying the smell of salt and seaweed. A gull cried somewhere above the tide. To anyone watching, they were just 3 children, laughing and alive. Somewhere between the site of the cozy cinema and the corner of Prince's Avenue, the line broke. Bill turned to make sure his brother was keeping up. The space behind Shirley was empty. He called Peter's name. No answer. He ran back a few yards, then farther, scanning the edges of the promenade, the steps leading down to the beach, the benches near the railing. The sea stretched out gray and cold, its surface unbroken. He shouted again, louder this time. Shirley joined in, her voice thinner, trembling. They expected to see him appear from behind a lamp post or wave from the sand below. But there was nothing, no movement, no sound, just the wind and the slow rhythm of the waves. At first they thought it was a game. Peter was hiding, they decided, maybe behind the sea wall, maybe pretending to scare them. They searched the obvious spots, behind the bench, down the steps, under the pier archway, but 3-year-olds don't hide for long, and Peter was easily frightened. After a few minutes, the laughter in their voices disappeared. Bill told Shirley to wait while he ran ahead toward home. Maybe Peter had gone back by himself. Maybe he was already there. He sprinted down the street, his small legs burning, his heart hammering against his chest. When he reached the gate of their house, the yard was empty. The kitchen door stood open. Their mother was inside peeling potatoes. Bill gasped out the words between breaths. Peter's gone. For a moment, Marian didn't understand. Gone where? Gone home with someone? She wiped her hands on her apron, stepped outside, and looked down the street. The sky was already turning the color of pewter. She told Shirley to come home and began walking quickly toward the promenade, calling Peter's name as she went. Neighbors noticed, came out onto their porches, asked what was wrong. Within minutes, half the street was searching, some heading toward the beach, others toward Queen Street. No one found anything. By early evening, the laughter and chatter of the seaside had been replaced by an unease that settled over the town like fog. Families at supper lowered their voices when they heard the shouting in the distance. Somewhere out beyond the sea wall, the tide was coming in, slow and deliberate. The wind carried the smell of brine and fear. When darkness fell, lamps were lit along the promenade. People continued to search with flashlights and lanterns, calling the boy's name into the waves. Bill stood beside his mother, too frightened to cry. He kept saying, "He was just there. He was right behind us." Marian said nothing, only stared at the black horizon as if it might answer her. Later, much later, neighbors would try to recall every detail of that afternoon. Some said they saw 3 children playing near the railing. Others insisted they saw only 2. A few claimed they heard a splash, though no one could be sure. Memory, they discovered, was as slippery as the sea itself. That night, the town went quiet. No one could explain how a child could vanish on a familiar street, in daylight, surrounded by people who all knew his name. The beach was empty, the tide high, the search unfinished. The last trace of Peter Greenwood was the echo of his small boots on the promenade. And then, nothing at all. And from that moment, no one ever saw the boy again. By dawn, the next morning, word had spread through Withernsea that a little boy had gone missing on the promenade. The sea mist was still hanging low, wrapping the town in a damp gray veil. Men walking to early shifts stopped at doorways to ask questions. Shopkeepers opened late. Women stood in clusters on street corners, whispering. In a place as small as Withernsea, news moved faster than the tide. Before 8 o'clock, half the town knew his name. Peter Greenwood, age 3, missing since Tuesday evening. Police officers from the local station arrived first, then Coast Guards from Hornsea, and a few soldiers still stationed nearby from the wartime base. They began the kind of search everyone hoped would be brief. A simple sweep that would end with the discovery of a frightened child asleep behind a wall or hiding under a pier. The officers worked methodically, marking grids in the sand with poles, calling his name into the wind. Volunteers walked along the top of the sea wall with lanterns. Fishermen launched small boats to check the shoreline from the water. Every direction looked the same. Empty. Marian Greenwood waited on the promenade, her arms wrapped tightly around herself. Bill and Shirley were kept indoors at a neighbor's house. The constable in charge, Sergeant Murray, spoke gently but clearly. They had to consider the sea. The tide had been high the evening before. If the boy had slipped, he said, the current could have carried him out toward the Humber estuary. Marian didn't answer. She stared at the line where the waves met the gray morning sky. She had lived beside that water all her life, but she had never felt it look so indifferent. Through the afternoon, groups of men dragged the shallows with ropes and hooks. Others scoured the dunes and checked the narrow alleys behind the seafront houses. The town's children were told to stay indoors. A small crowd gathered near the cozy cinema, where the last confirmed sighting had taken place. The manager told police he remembered the Greenwood children leaving together, laughing and skipping. No one else recalled seeing the boy after that. A shopkeeper on Queen Street thought she saw them pass by her window around 4 o'clock, 3 small figures in a line. But when asked again later, she hesitated. "Maybe it was 2, she said softly. "Maybe I just assumed there were 3. By the end of the second day, the search had grown desperate. The Coast Guard requested assistance from neighboring stations, and a Royal Air Force pilot flying supply runs to the north offered to scan the coastline from the air. From above, Withernsea looked like a cluster of roofs pressed against a vast, restless sea. Nothing moved along the beach except the white curls of surf. The report came back. No body, no clothing, no sign of anything unusual. That night, the Holderness Gazette printed the headline, "Child Missing from Prince's Avenue." The article described widespread community concern and extensive searches carried out by police, residents, and Coast Guards. It ended with a sentence that felt more like a plea than a report. Anyone with information is urged to contact the local authorities immediately. For most readers, it was the first time they saw the name Peter Greenwood. For Marion, seeing it in print made it real in a way that words in the air never had. The next morning she folded the paper carefully and placed it inside the Bible on her kitchen table. The following week, the weather turned rough. Wind pushed waves hard against the promenade, washing away the footprints of the searchers. Still, they kept looking. Divers from Hull were brought in to inspect the harbor mouth. They found nothing. A farmer outside town reported seeing a small figure walking along a hedgerow the night of the disappearance, but the distance and the darkness made it impossible to confirm. Rumors began to grow, as they always do when answers run out, that the boy had been taken inland by travelers passing through, that he had fallen into a drain, that he had been seen boarding a truck heading toward Hull. Each rumor was pursued, and each one dissolved into nothing. After 2 weeks, the official search was scaled back. The constable's report, neat and spare, summarized the situation in 1 paragraph. Subject last seen by siblings at approximately 1600 hours, April 30th, 1946, near the Withernsea Promenade. Extensive searches conducted by land, sea, and air. No evidence of foul play. Presumed accidental drowning. The file was kept open, pending further information. None came. For the Greenwood family, time stopped in those first days. Marion's health began to decline. She refused food, sleeping only in short bursts, waking often at night convinced she'd heard a knock at the door. The children's father, silent and practical, took leave from work to assist in the search. He walked the beach each morning at low tide, eyes fixed on the horizon. Nothing ever appeared. By late summer, Marion's strength gave out. She died that September, aged 29. The death certificate cited pneumonia, but those who knew her said it was sorrow that killed her. The case itself remained open but dormant. Police had little to investigate and less to prove. Post-war England had no central system for missing person records, and cross-county coordination was slow and inconsistent. Files were typed on thin carbon paper, stored in metal drawers that rusted in the sea air. In a decade that had already seen so much loss, one more vanished child quietly joined the long list of names that would never reach a conclusion. Yet among the people of Withernsea, the story lingered. For months afterward, parents called their children in early from the beach. Shopkeepers locked doors a bit sooner after dark. The promenade, once filled with laughter and gossip, grew silent in the evenings. A sense of unease settled over the town. Not fear exactly, but a kind of guilt, as if the sea had taken something that belonged to them all. Bill and Shirley returned to school, small and subdued, whispered about by classmates who didn't know what to say. Bill, the older brother, carried a quiet determination that would never quite fade. Every few weeks, he walked the same route home from the old cinema, stopping at the same railing, staring down towards the sand where his brother had last been. He would trace the pattern of the pavement with his shoe and whisper, "He was right here." As the months passed, the community's attention shifted back to daily life. The ration queues, the rebuilding, the small celebrations of survival. Peter Greenwood's name remained in the police ledger, a short line between numbers. But for one family, the absence became permanent, a hollow place at every meal, a silence that deepened with each passing year. And so the first chapter of the investigation closed, not with discovery, but with exhaustion. The sea gave back nothing. The witnesses remembered little, and the boy who had vanished from the promenade became a story parents told in low voices about the danger of the tide, the unpredictability of the world, and the thin line between ordinary life and the moment it disappears. In the years after 1946, Withernsea returned to the rhythm of ordinary life. But the Greenwood name lingered like a half-remembered echo. The war had left Britain exhausted. Rationing continued into the early 1950s, and most people were too busy surviving to dwell on unsolved tragedies. Yet for one family, life divided itself into a clear before and after. Before April 30th, 1946, the world made sense. After that day, every sound from the sea seemed to carry the possibility of a lost voice calling back. Marion Greenwood's death that autumn was the first blow in a series of quiet losses. Her husband, Thomas, withdrew into work, a man who had already known too much absence. Bill and Shirley grew up in the long shadow of that single afternoon. They lived with relatives for a time, then moved inland to live with an aunt near Hull. The sea, once the backdrop of their childhood, became something they avoided. Bill, only 6 when Peter vanished, could never quite forgive himself for turning around too late. It became a thought that followed him into every new decade. One glance, 1 second, 1 heartbeat. That's all it might have taken. The 1950s passed, and Britain modernized. Streets that had been dark and quiet gained neon signs, new cars, and holiday crowds. Withernsea built guest houses for summer visitors. The promenade was repaired and repainted, as if to erase the memory of what it had witnessed. Tourists walked the same path where Peter had vanished, unaware that it had ever been anything but scenic. Local children still heard the story in whispers, the boy who disappeared into the sea. But it sounded more like a warning than a memory. Officially, the case remained, open but uninvestigated. In 1952, an officer reviewing unsolved files wrote a short note, "No further evidence. Recommend closure." There was no family left in town to object. The file was boxed, transferred to regional storage in York, and filed under M. Portor Greenwood, Peter, missing juvenile. Decades later, those boxes would reportedly be destroyed in a records purge, leaving only a few newspaper cuttings and a photograph to stand for the whole event. For Bill, adulthood came with both distance and obsession. He left Withernsea when he was called for national service, married a woman named Barbara, and settled eventually in Gloucestershire. He worked as a mechanic, raised children, and tried to build the kind of stability his parents never had. But the wound followed him quietly, resurfacing in the way he told stories. Friends remembered him as kind but preoccupied. Sometimes, after a drink, he would talk about the sea. He'd describe the sound of the tide on concrete, the way light flickered off the water that evening. "You never hear silence like that," he once told a coworker. "It's the kind that waits." Shirley, more reserved, spoke little of her brother. She built a small life in Leeds, taught school, and kept a single photograph of the 3 of them in a wooden frame. When asked, she would only say, "He was 3. He followed us everywhere." It was not grief that shaped her, but restraint, the quiet discipline of living on without explanation. Through the 1960s and 70s, missing person cases became more centralized in Britain. New agencies, new record systems, and the introduction of national police databases meant that disappearances were harder to forget. Yet the Greenwood case belonged to another era, before the digital age, before consistent forensic standards. Its evidence, if it ever existed, was lost to dust and damp. No fingerprints, no clothing, no remains. Only memory. In 1986, the 40th anniversary passed unnoticed except by Bill. That summer, he drove to Withernsea alone. The town had changed, newer houses, brighter shops, but the sea was the same. He parked near the old cinema site, now a derelict lot, and walked the route he'd taken as a child. He followed the curve of the promenade to Prince's Avenue, counting the steps as if they might add up to an answer. When he reached the spot where his brother had vanished, he stood for a long time, then wrote a note on a scrap of paper. Still looking. He left it under a loose stone near the railing. In the 1990s, Bill began writing letters to the local paper, the Holderness Gazette. He didn't seek headlines, only memory. Every few years, his short messages appeared in the Letters to the Editor section. Does anyone remember the disappearance of Peter Greenwood, aged 3, April 1946? Some responded with sympathy, others with fragments of recollection that led nowhere. One elderly man claimed to remember search parties combing the beach. Another thought he'd heard that the boy's mother had thrown herself into the sea. The stories contradicted one another, blurred by time. In 2002, more than half a century after the disappearance, Bill received an anonymous letter. The writer claimed to have been a young witness in 1946, now elderly and remorseful. They said they had seen a small child jumping or falling from the sea wall into the water near the old promenade, and that they had been too frightened to tell anyone. "I hope this brings you some comfort," the letter concluded, "and that you may finally rest." Bill answered the letter, asking for details, but no reply ever came. He kept the envelope in a drawer beside his bed for the rest of his life. To some, that letter sounded plausible. To others, it felt like an act of misplaced mercy, a stranger's attempt to close a wound they did not understand. As time passed, even the local archives began to forget. The cozy cinema was torn down. The promenade was rebuilt again. New generations grew up without ever hearing the name Greenwood. Yet Bill continued his pilgrimages to the sea. Each visit, he would walk the same path, kneel by the wall, and press his palm against the cold stone. "He was 3, he'd whisper. "He was right here." When he died in 2023, at 83, his granddaughter Kizzy found the old photograph, the letters, and the clipping from the Gazette. She had grown up hearing fragments of the story, always half-finished, half-whispered, but she had never realized how much of her grandfather's life had revolved around that single moment. Sorting through his papers, she saw the note he'd left decades earlier. Still looking. In that phrase, she heard both devotion and defeat. That discovery changed everything. Within months, she began piecing together the fragments herself, searching archives, contacting police, and reaching out to journalists. For the first time in nearly 80 years, someone was speaking Peter Greenwood's name again in public. The case that had gone cold for generations was about to warm back to life, not with new evidence, but with renewed memory. But in the long silence between the disappearance and its rediscovery, the Greenwood story had already become something larger than one family's grief. It was a reflection of how loss can fade from public record while remaining vivid in private hearts. It was the kind of mystery that never truly sleeps, only waits for someone patient enough to remember where to begin. When Kizzy Elliott opened the worn envelope marked Family Papers, she expected photographs and ration cards, not the echoes of a mystery older than her father. Her grandfather, Bill Greenwood, had died only a few weeks earlier, leaving behind a box that smelled faintly of salt and thyme. Inside were yellowed letters, old newspaper clippings, and one small, cracked photograph of a dark-haired boy wearing a white jumper. The eyes in the picture were curious, direct, almost solemn. On the back, written in faint blue ink, was a date, 30 April 1946. Beneath it, a single word, Peter. She knew the name, vaguely, from family whispers. "Your grandfather's brother," someone had said once, with the casual tone adults use when they don't want to explain too much. But reading through the brittle papers, Kizzy realized how deeply that single afternoon had shaped generations. There were letters her grandfather had written to the Holderness Gazette, typed copies of old police forms, and the envelope containing the anonymous note from 2002, the one that spoke of a boy seen jumping from the sea wall. Next to it lay a folded sheet of paper, its ink still clear despite the years. Still looking. In that moment, Kizzy decided she couldn't let the story end in a drawer. She began searching, first out of curiosity, then out of duty. Her grandfather had carried the weight of a lost brother his entire life. Now, she felt, it was hers to carry forward. By early 2024, she contacted Humberside Police, asking whether any records from 1946 still existed. The response was polite, but uncertain. Most files from that era, an officer explained, had been transferred to York decades ago and later destroyed. What remained were newspaper archives, scattered notes, and the memories of people who might no longer be alive. Still, the officer promised to look into it. Kizzy also reached out to the BBC regional desk in Hull, where a journalist named Charlie O'Loughlin had covered forgotten local mysteries. He listened quietly, then asked her to send what she had. Within weeks, the BBC published a short piece. Family's pain over 79-year mystery of missing boy. The article told the bare facts, the date, the place, the unanswered questions, and featured that same photograph of Peter Greenwood, cracked and sepia, staring at the camera with those wide brown eyes. The response surprised everyone. Within days, readers from across East Yorkshire began writing in vague recollections from childhood, stories their grandparents had told, fragments of community memory that had lain buried for generations. One woman recalled her mother speaking of search parties combing the promenade with lanterns. Another man said his father, a young constable at the time, had been haunted for years by the image of the child's mother calling into the waves. None of the recollections solved the mystery, but they restored what had been missing for decades. Attention. Local papers picked up the BBC story. Online forums began sharing the photograph. On the Withersea Memories Facebook group, Kizzy posted a digital copy of the photo and wrote, "If anyone remembers anything, even a rumor, please reach out. My family has been waiting 79 years." Comments flooded in. Some offered condolences. Others shared family anecdotes. A few suggested theories. A sudden tide, a wartime drain, even an abduction by a stranger passing through in the chaos after the war. Each possibility was plausible. None were provable. For the first time in decades, Humberside Police reopened a review of the case. Officers searched for surviving records, not evidence exactly, but traces of evidence. Duty logs, incident cards, or coastal patrol notes that might have been preserved in microfilm. They found almost nothing concrete. The only official confirmation of the investigation came from a single entry in a long-retired constable's ledger listing "Search, missing child, male, aged 3, presumed drowned, no recovery." The line was dated May 2, 1946. Nothing followed, but the lack of files made the story stronger. Journalists from The Guardian, The Independent, and the Daily Mail echoed the BBC's reporting, noting that Peter's case was an emblem of post-war Britain's forgotten losses. They interviewed Kizzy, who spoke calmly but firmly. "Just to have his name recognized again means more than I can say. For nearly 80 years, he was a photograph and a silence." The renewed coverage turned the mystery into something larger, a meditation on how easily history can erase the vulnerable. Reporters revisited the social landscape of 1946, when wartime displacement and rationing blurred accountability. Thousands of families had been uprooted. Records were incomplete, identification systems patchy. A lost child could vanish not just physically, but bureaucratically. Peter's disappearance became a symbol of that fragility. Meanwhile, Withernsea itself began to remember. Elderly residents, now in their late 80s and 90s, started contacting Kizzy. One man said he had been a boy in the crowd that searched the beach that night. Another remembered his father returning home soaked and speechless after joining the drag lines. The old cinema site, long redeveloped, became a quiet point of pilgrimage. Locals left flowers there, not because they expected answers, but because acknowledgement felt like a kind of justice. In China, social media accounts discussing cold cases and historical injustices briefly shared translated versions of the BBC story, framing it as a universal reminder that even in peaceful societies, missing children can be forgotten when systems fail. Some commenters drew parallels to their own experiences, where families of missing persons still gather to demand truth decades later. "Memory is justice," one user wrote. The remark spread widely, crossing languages and borders, proof that the pain of uncertainty needs no translation. By late 2024, Humberside Police confirmed that the case was officially under review. Officers collaborated with North Yorkshire Police to verify whether any of the original coastal search records might have survived in local archives. They also contacted the Maritime and Coast Guard Agency to check historical logs of drownings or unidentified remains recovered in the Humber region between 1946 and 1947. None matched Peter's description. The investigation produced no body, no new evidence, but something far more powerful: recognition. After nearly 80 years, the Greenwood family's story had moved from rumor to record, from private grief to public history. In a later interview, Kizzy said softly, "I know I'm late to the search, but I owe it to my grandfather to finish what he started. He carried guilt his whole life. He never stopped hoping that one day someone would remember." Her words resonated beyond Yorkshire. For historians and criminologists, the case illustrated how trauma can travel invisibly through generations, waiting for one person, often a descendant, to reopen the door. For the town, it was a reckoning with its own silence. In December 2024, a local community group organized a small memorial by the promenade. The wind was cold, the sea restless, as it had been that April evening long ago. A single framed photograph of Peter stood on a wooden stand beside a candle that flickered in the salt air. No speeches, no ceremony, only a moment of collective quiet. An old man in the crowd murmured, "He's home, in memory, if not in body." As dusk fell, Kizzy stood at the railing, looking out at the gray horizon her family had feared for nearly 8 decades. She held the original photograph, the one that had survived wars, moves, and time itself. When she spoke, her voice was steady. "People forget, but the sea doesn't. It keeps everything, even names." The camera of history turned back toward her, toward the faded photograph, toward a family's endurance. And somewhere behind the wind, the old question still hung unanswered. How does a boy vanish on a short walk home? And why did it take nearly a lifetime for his story to be heard again? When the police review concluded in early 2025, there was little new to show for months of careful work. No files uncovered, no witnesses newly identified, no body recovered. But the process itself had awakened something deeper. A hunger for answers. not only from the Greenwood family, but from everyone who had followed the case. For a story buried nearly 80 years, the absence of proof only made the mystery sharper. The question that had hovered since 1946 returned with full force. What really happened on the promenade that evening? The most conventional explanation, and the one originally entered in the police file, was accidental drowning. Withernsea's seawall in the mid-1940s was steep, slippery, and unguarded in places. The tide could surge quickly, and a child of 3 could have lost his footing easily. In theory, Peter might have fallen unnoticed into the churning gray water, carried out by the undertow before anyone could react. For decades, that explanation served as the town's quiet consensus. It required no villain, only misfortune. Yet the problem with the drowning theory had always been the same. No body. The North Sea, along that coast, is shallow and tidal. Drowned victims, even small ones, almost always resurface within days. In Peter's case, nothing was ever found. Not a shoe, not a scrap of clothing. Fishermen dragged the shallows, the Coast Guard swept the beaches for weeks, and still the sea kept its silence. By contrast, Bill Greenwood, Peter's older brother, had never accepted the drowning idea. Even as a child, he insisted his brother had been taken. "He was behind us," he once told a reporter. "And then he wasn't. That's not the sea. That's someone." In later years, he developed his own theory, that a stranger might have approached from behind, coaxing the boy away. Post-war Britain, flooded with displaced people, itinerant workers, and soldiers moving between posts, offered endless possibilities. Police records from 1946 list dozens of unverified sightings of wandering men along the Yorkshire coast. It was an unsettled time, trains running late, families separated, children curious and unguarded. But no one had ever come forward claiming to have seen a stranger with a child that evening. The town had been busy, but not crowded. People knew one another's faces. To take a child in daylight, on a public path, without drawing notice, that seemed nearly impossible. And yet, so did vanishing into thin air. The third possibility was whispered only years later, that Peter might have wandered inland rather than toward the sea, confused by the game, perhaps following another family. In this version, he might have been taken in by someone, accidentally or deliberately, and raised under another name. It was a hope as much as a theory, and for Bill, it was the one that kept him from despair. He told his granddaughter once, "I used to think he was still out there somewhere, maybe not remembering who he was. Maybe he grew up thinking he belonged to someone else." In the early 2000s, that fragile hope took the form of a letter. The envelope arrived without a return address, postmarked from Hull, written in a careful hand that trembled slightly. It said, "I was a boy at the seawall that day. I saw a small child climb up and jump into the water. I never told anyone because I was afraid. I hope this brings you comfort." Bill's heart must have raced as he read it. For more than half a century, he had imagined every version of that moment: accident, abduction, miracle. Now, here was someone claiming to have witnessed it, to know for certain. But the relief was hollow. The letter gave no details, no time, no description, no explanation of how the writer could be sure the child was Peter. It was unsigned, impossible to verify. Bill wrote back, pleading for more information, but no reply ever came. He kept the letter anyway, folded neatly in his bedside drawer. Years later, his granddaughter would find it among his papers. The ink had faded, but the words remained legible, frozen in ambiguity. Some journalists suggested the letter might have been an act of compassion, an anonymous attempt to grant closure to an old man haunted by guilt. Others thought it might have been genuine, though unverifiable. Either way, it became part of the Greenwood archive, not evidence, but emotion turned into artifact. Modern analysts reviewing the case have pointed out how often families of missing persons receive similar messages: letters, phone calls, dreams, visions, each claiming to know what happened, none conclusive. Psychologists call it the mercy of fiction, the human impulse to fill the unbearable gap where facts should be. In that sense, the Greenwood case had transcended its small-town origins and entered a broader realm, the landscape of absence that defines all unsolved mysteries. When the BBC revisited the story after the police review, they interviewed experts in historical crime and child welfare. One noted, post-war record-keeping was chaotic. If the boy had been found inland, even alive, there was no national database to connect him to Withernsea. It's possible, however unlikely, that Peter lived under another name. Another researcher added, after the war, adoption and fostering systems were informal, often unrecorded. Some children displaced during evacuations were never traced back to their birth families. Those statements gave the story a strange new life. Hope, once considered naive, became at least statistically possible. People began speculating online. Could Peter have survived, grown up elsewhere, even emigrated? Theories multiplied: plausible, far-fetched, compassionate, cruel. The truth remained still, unmoved at the center. Meanwhile, for Kizzy Elliott, the story had shifted from an investigation to an act of remembrance. She told an interviewer, "I'm not looking for a body. I'm looking for acknowledgement. For 79 years, he was a ghost in our family. Not alive, not dead, just missing. That's no way for anyone to exist." Her calm persistence kept the story in the news, long after journalists had moved on. At a small gathering in early 2025, organized by local historians, she read aloud the words from her grandfather's old note. "Still looking." The phrase, written in his steady hand, echoed through the quiet hall like a vow. "It's not just about finding him," she said softly. "It's about proving he mattered." The audience, a mix of residents, retirees, and a few curious students, sat in silence. The sea outside could be heard faintly through the open windows, the same sea that had carried both hope and fear for nearly 8 decades. By the time the event ended, a few people lingered to speak with her. One elderly woman approached slowly, holding a walking stick. "My father was on that search," she said. "He never forgot. He said the mother kept calling into the wind long after everyone else stopped." She paused, eyes distant. "He said that's the sound that haunted him, not the sea, but the calling." In that exchange lay the quiet truth of the Greenwood case. Facts might never surface, but echoes endure, in letters, in photographs, in the trembling voices of those who still remember. Theories can shift with time, but the essence remains. A child vanished, a family waited, and the sea, eternal witness, refused to give an answer. The Greenwood case never went to court. There was no defendant, no charge sheet, no cross-examination, only a silence that lasted longer than any sentence could. And yet, in its own way, it became a matter for the law. When Humberside Police reopened their review in 2024, they consulted historians of policing to understand how such a disappearance might have been handled in 1946. What they found was less a failure than an absence of structure. Britain's post-war justice system was still reassembling itself. Many rural departments were understaffed, relying on part-time constables or retired soldiers. Evidence collection was rudimentary. Coastal patrols were recorded in handwritten logs that could be misplaced with ease. The concept of a cold case unit did not exist. In that era, law enforcement often served not as investigators of mystery, but as restorers of public order. When the search for Peter Greenwood produced nothing, the presumption of drowning became a kind of bureaucratic necessity. It closed the circle, offered the illusion of explanation, and allowed the system to move on. No crime meant no file, and no file meant no future investigation. Legally, the boy was gone. Administratively, he was forgotten. For nearly 8 decades, that absence functioned as a verdict without trial. The town accepted it, quietly, perhaps even gratefully. To declare a mystery unsolvable is to make it less frightening. But as the years passed and the story resurfaced, a different kind of justice began to form, one not written in statutes, but in remembrance. When journalists revisited the case, they spoke with legal scholars about historical accountability. One professor at the University of Leeds said, "The Greenwood case illustrates how systems fail not only when they make mistakes, but when they do nothing at all. Bureaucratic silence is a kind of erasure." Another criminologist added, "There's no statute of limitations on memory. If an injustice persists in the hearts of those left behind, it remains active, morally, if not legally." In that sense, the Greenwood case entered a new category, a moral cold case. Not a mystery to be solved, but a question to be carried. The renewed attention, the community vigils, the public discussions, all served as a form of restorative justice, an acknowledgement of harm in the absence of resolution. For Kizzy Elliott, who had become both archivist and advocate, the distinction mattered deeply. "I'm not asking for prosecutions," she said during a BBC interview in early 2025. "I just want his name written somewhere official, not as presumed drowned, but as missing, never found. Because that's the truth. That's the honest truth." Her request may have seemed small, but it spoke to something profound: the human need for truth to be recorded, even when it cannot be proven. In response, the local police authority issued a statement confirming that Peter Greenwood's name would be listed in their regional database of historical unsolved disappearances. It was, in essence, a gesture of acknowledgement, a correction in the record. For the Greenwood family, it felt like justice in miniature, not the courtroom kind, but the kind that says, "We see you now, we believe you existed." At the same time, the story's renewed visibility reignited debate across Britain about forgotten victims of the post-war era. Newspapers ran editorials asking how many others had vanished into bureaucratic gaps: evacuees misplaced during wartime, fostered children never traced, families who simply stopped asking because no one listened. Legal historians argued for better preservation of pre-digital records. One MP from Yorkshire even proposed a motion urging the Home Office to fund the digitization of old county archives. It was modest, symbolic, but it began because of one photograph of a small boy in a white jumper. Beyond policy, though, the case's real impact was psychological. Communities, especially small ones, live on shared narratives. For decades, Withernsea had carried the Greenwood story like a scar beneath the surface, unspoken, but felt. When the town began to speak of it again, something shifted. A local teacher included the case in a class on local history. The town library created a small exhibit with newspaper clippings, a timeline, and a map of the original search area. Visitors left notes on a corkboard. "I remember my father joining the search. My mother said everyone lit lamps that night. I never knew his name until now." In those gestures, the law of compassion replaced the law of proof. Justice in its most human form had returned not through punishment, but through presence. Scholars of trauma often speak of transgenerational silence, the way pain passes down through families, not in words, but in behavior, in the spaces people avoid. The Greenwood case was a perfect example. Marion's death in 1946 had left her surviving children shaped by absence. Bill carried guilt, Shirley carried quiet, and both passed those traits forward without meaning to. When Kizzy began her search, She was not only reopening a file, but interrupting a pattern. She gave the family permission to speak. In doing so, she also gave the town permission to remember. Memory, once shared, ceases to be a burden. It becomes an inheritance. That, perhaps, is the truest form of justice the Greenwood case could achieve. The legal record may never say more than missing, presumed drowned. But the moral record now tells a richer story, one of endurance, love, and the refusal to let silence have the final word. On the 80th anniversary of the disappearance, the town council voted unanimously to place a small plaque on the promenade. It would bear only a few words. In memory of Peter Greenwood, aged 3, disappeared April 30th, 1946, still remembered. No marble, no ceremony, just a quiet reminder that absence too deserves a marker. That evening, the wind came in from the sea, sharp and clean. Lanterns flickered along the railings as townspeople gathered for a brief moment of reflection. No speeches, no cameras, only silence, and the sound of the tide pressing against the wall. Kizzy stood among them, her hair lifted by the wind, the photograph of her great-uncle tucked safely in her coat pocket. When someone asked what she hoped to find next, she smiled faintly. "Maybe nothing," she said. "Maybe we already found what we needed, proof that forgetting isn't final." As the tide began to rise, the candlelight shimmered against the wet stones of the promenade. In the space between law and memory, between truth and faith, justice had finally taken its quiet shape. Morning comes slowly in Withernsea. The light pushes through a thin mist, spreading across the rooftops, touching the worn stones of the promenade. The sea below, gray and patient, moves as it always has, never hurried, never revealing what it holds. Nearly 80 years have passed since the boy named Peter Greenwood walked this same path, trailing his brother and sister in a game of follow the leader. Nothing remains of that afternoon but air and memory. And yet, in a strange way, he is still here. Time does not erase the missing. It only reshapes the outline of their absence. What was once panic becomes myth. What was once pain becomes history. For decades, the Greenwood story lived quietly in the undercurrent of the town, passed through whispers, misremembered, simplified. The boy who drowned, people said, as though naming the loss could explain it. But now, as the tide rolls in against the newly restored seawall, the story has returned to its full shape. Not a drowning, not an abduction, not even a mystery to be solved, but a record of what it means to endure uncertainty. The plaque on the promenade catches the first sun of the day. Its brass letters are simple, almost plain. In memory of Peter Greenwood, aged 3, disappeared April 30th, 1946, still remembered. Visitors pause to read it, some out of curiosity, others because they know the story. Local children trace the letters with their fingertips, asking who he was. Teachers tell them, a boy from long ago. He went missing, and his family never stopped looking. And for a moment, in the still air above the sea, he exists again. Inside the Greenwood family, the story has changed shape too. What began as grief has turned into something gentler. Remembrance. Bill's children and grandchildren no longer speak of guilt, but of devotion. He kept the search alive, Kizzy tells them. That was his way of loving. The old photograph, once folded and hidden in a drawer, now hangs framed in her home. The cracks on its surface have become part of its meaning, the visible marks of time, like wrinkles on a face that has waited too long. In 2025, the Holderness Gazette ran a final piece marking the 80th anniversary of the disappearance. It was short, factual, and quietly dignified. The case of Peter Greenwood remains unsolved, though not forgotten. His story endures as a reminder of community, compassion, and the persistence of memory. Beneath the text was that same photograph, the same eyes, still steady after all these years. No new evidence was found, no final word from the sea, but perhaps none was needed. The truth, after all, had never belonged entirely to the realm of fact. It lived in the waiting, in the persistence, in the refusal to let absence become silence. Kizzy's campaign had grown into something larger, a network for families of long-term missing persons, many from decades past. She worked with historical investigators, local museums, even archivists in York who were digitizing forgotten files. "If one story can be restored," she said, "then others can too." Her efforts helped uncover more than 20 other wartime and post-war missing child cases once believed destroyed. None of them had clear endings, but each regained a name, a photograph, and a space in public record, a kind of resurrection. Withernsea itself changed too. The promenade, once a symbol of loss, became a place of quiet reflection. Each spring, on the last weekend of April, townspeople leave flowers by the railing. Some bring candles, others seashells or small toys, gestures of empathy across generations. No one leads the gathering. It happens naturally, wordlessly. As dusk falls, people stand facing the water, watching the tide blur the horizon into silver and gray. They say nothing, because there is nothing left to say. The sea moves, unbroken. Scholars sometimes describe unresolved loss as open grief, the kind that never closes but still allows life to continue. The Greenwood case has become an emblem of that. In lectures and documentaries, it is cited not as a tragedy, but as a lesson. That closure is not always the same as peace, and that remembering can itself be an act of justice. For many, that understanding is enough. For some, it is everything. In the quiet moments that follow each memorial, the sound of the sea rises. It's easy to imagine the voices of those who once searched this shore. Men calling into the dark, women lighting lanterns, children pressing their faces to cold windows. It's easy, too, to imagine Marion Greenwood, the mother who never stopped calling, her voice carried by the wind long after her body gave out. That sound, the echo of calling, still seems to linger when the waves strike the wall just right, not as a haunting, but as a presence, tender and endless. When Kizzy walks the promenade now, she often pauses at the plaque. Sometimes she leaves a flower, sometimes she leaves nothing at all. "I come just to be here," she says. "It feels like he finally has a place again." She doesn't believe the sea will ever return him, but she believes it remembers. And that's enough. Every story leaves a tide mark, the line between what can be known and what must be accepted. For the Greenwood family, that line runs between the past and the present, between the boy who vanished and the people who refused to let him vanish twice. The sea may keep its secrets, but it no longer keeps their silence. As dusk settles, the waves darken to slate, reflecting the faint lights from the town above. The air carries a hint of salt and memory. The plaque gleams softly under the lamplight, modest, resolute, enduring. In its reflection, the whole story seems to rest. A small boy walking home, the brother who turned too late, the mother who called into the wind, the generations who followed the trail of silence to its edge. And if you stand there long enough, when the wind drops and the sea is calm, you can almost hear it, not the sound of loss, but of continuity, the steady, timeless rhythm of water against stone, the heartbeat of a story that refused to die. The sea, as ever, keeps its secrets, but now, at last, so does memory. If stories like this remind you that some names should never fade, subscribe to the channel. Each view, each share, helps another story be remembered.